Which means we could have used that room. Okay, is it good now? It's okay? Okay, Baruch Hashem. Thank you. So, we are in Perek Vav, Mishnah Vav, chapter 6, Mishnah 6. And we're at the point where there's 48 ways or 48 elements to learning Torah. And we're at the point within those 48 where, remember, everything up until now was positive things that you have to do or things that you should develop within yourself in order to be able to connect with Torah. And I said that the cluster we're going to be looking at today are things that you're supposed to avoid, or at least avoid is not really the correct word, because you'll see that each time the word is mi'ut. So it actually means that it's about diminishing something. There's a big difference between avoiding something outright and diminishing it. Big difference, right? Okay, so what are the things? 6 things. 6 things that we have to diminish. The nice part of this is that it sounds good in the beginning. I could handle that. And then we get to the ones that, oh no. I was hoping you weren't going to say that. So here are the 6 things. Number 1, b'mi'ut schoira. What's schoira? Merchandise. In other words, business. So merchandise or business. So in other words, the first thing is that you have to diminish business dealings. If a person wants to acquire Torah, then they have to diminish business dealings. Number 2, b'mi'ut derech eretz. That's strange, right? B'mi'ut, so I'm going to leave that. I told you we're going to start where it was going to be, oh, that's fine. And then, b'mi'ut derech eretz, with reducing derech eretz. What does that mean? Okay, hold that thought. We're going to come back and try and understand what that means. The next one is fairly simple. B'mi'ut tainug, diminishing pleasure.
It's also difficult.
Is it difficult?
Yes, if you're enjoying
No, that's difficult to do, but not difficult to understand. B'mi'ut derech eretz took us a little bit by surprise. Then, b'mi'ut sheina, reducing sleep. Yeah, I knew people exactly. Right? B'mi'ut sicha, reducing conversation.
Yes.
And b'mi'ut schoik, reducing laughter. Okay? So it sounds like quite an austere kind of way of living. You know, you've got to get rid of all the good things in life. You've got to get rid of pleasure, you've got to get rid of conversation, you've got to get rid of joy, right?
Good one for Erev Tisha B'Av.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's try and understand what's going on over here. Okay? But like I say, it's really important for us to recognize that we're not saying get rid of any of these things. We're not saying don't sleep. We're not saying don't do business. We're not saying don't laugh. Mi'ut means to diminish all of these things from what might either be the social norm or what might have come naturally to us. So let's understand. Let's start right at the beginning. The one that is the most comfortable for all of us, b'mi'ut sechoira, to diminish business. Okay? So everybody's like, yes. Now you can go home and you can say, you shouldn't be working so long, you should be coming home at a decent hour, you shouldn't be doing all these business trips, right? That's kind of what it sounds like. So do you remember, well, it's actually coming up in the parasha still in a few weeks' time, but do you remember the famous line? What does it say? That Torah loy bashamayim hi. You've heard that expression, right? Torah is not in Shamayim. But that's not the only part of the expression. The pasuk says, Veloy me'ever layom hi. And Torah is not across the ocean. Now, for those of us who are paying tuition in yeshivas and seminaries, in dollars, we like that idea that Torah should not have to be across the ocean. We'd much rather have it local. But Loi me'ever layam hi, that the Torah is not across the sea. So it's very interesting that the commentaries point out that what that means is that a person who's traveling for business, because that's what crossing the sea, why else would a person travel overseas in those days? They weren't going touring. Nobody was going to the Greek islands for the summer vacation in those days. So if you were traveling across the sea, it was typically because you were going seeking your fortune and you wanted to earn a living. So Loi me'ever layam hi, Torah is not something which you can find in people who are schlepping around the world trying to make a living. That's what he's saying over here. B'mi'ut schoira, a person, and that's why it's specifically merchandise. Because that's how Sechora works. You've got to go to a place, you've got to source the material, then you've got to bring it back and obviously sell it in wherever it is that you live. So, but miut Sechora, if a person reduces how much they're schlepping and traveling and going all over the place trying to earn a living, they'll have much more time to study Torah. That's the simplest explanation of that particular teaching. But there's another explanation as well. And that's not just quantitative. Work less. Right? There's this whole wisdom that's come out in the world today about reducing how much time you spend at work, and they're talking about whatever it is, the 10-hour work week or the 20-hour work week or whatever the thing is, that, if you work smart and not work hard, that's not what he's talking about. I mean, that is part of what it is, because a Jewish person is supposed to designate time to learn Torah, and as the Gemara tells us, he's supposed to go from Beis HaKnesses to Beis HaMedrash. You get up in the morning, you go to shul, at least for the men, and straight after shul, they're supposed to sit down and learn. So that's obviously going to cause miut schora. You're going to be less time in the business because you're spending time learning. You know the old story that they say, a guy walks into a shop and he sees this Jew behind the counter is running his shop, but he's sitting there with a Gemara. And he's completely engrossed in learning Gemara. So the guy comes and says, this is not the way to run a business. You're supposed to be attentive to your customers. You're supposed to be proactive. You're supposed to be going out there, getting business. What is this? You're sitting and you're learning Gemara. He says, let me ask you a question. When you're in shul, do you ever land up speaking about business? He says, if you can talk about business in shul, you could learn Gemara in the business. So the point is, it's not just a quantity, how many hours, miut schora, diminish your hours that you are at work. It's something way more profound than that. And we're going to see this as a theme right across. That there's this concept of miut, of reducing something that is quite positive. In fact, before we get into that, let's look at this generically for a moment. What link do we have between the concept of miut and being Jewish? Miut reduction. Okay, so there you go. It's for I was going to say 1 month of the year, but it's not even 1 month, because after Tisha B'Av, we reinstate the Simcha. So where's the link between miut, reduction, and being Jewish?
Removing yourself from the world.
Removing ourselves from the world, which is very much this theme. So you pull out of the world of business. That's one form of removing ourselves from the world. What else? So, we know that the Torah says, Atem hama'at mikol ha'amim. How do we translate that? Atem, you. Hama'at are the least. Right? Some people translate it as the smallest, but that's not the word. Ma'at does not mean small. Atem hama'at mikol ha'amim. You are the least or the most diminished out of all of the nations. And in fact, Rashi immediately points out that hama'at means hey ma'at. Hey ma'at, that we're 5 steps smaller than the other nations. In other words, we talk about 70 nations, and you speak about the Jewish people at that particular point. But it says, Atem hama'at mikol ha'amim. It speaks about how we counted ourselves as 65 families. So there's 70 families and we're 65. Hey ma'at, 5 less than the rest of the world. But the point over here is not just that we're a smaller nation. I mean, have you ever wondered about this? What is it with the Jewish people that we always remain so small? Because if you look back in history, we didn't start off so much smaller than the rest of the world. So what happened? Atem hama'at. We're a nation that is not small in numbers, but small in humility. That's what hama'at means, to diminish ourselves. And that goes back, if you remember, it's one of the most intriguing Gemaras. Gemara in Chulin that tells us that on Rosh Chodesh, part of the communal sacrifices that had to be brought on Rosh Chodesh, so there's always the Musaf sacrifice, and it's a whole elaborate thing. But what's unique about Rosh Chodesh is that you also bring Seir Izim Echad Lechatos, that there's a goat that's brought communally as a sin offering. Generally, a sin offering, a chatos, cannot be a communal offering. The whole chap The whole purpose of a chatas offering is for an individual who's done something that they shouldn't have done, and they did it inadvertently, and now they have to atone, so they bring the chatas offering. It's very unusual to have a communal chatas offering outside of Yom Kippur. Obviously in Yom Kippur we have the chatas that's brought on behalf of the community. But the concept of a communal chatas offering is strange. The Gemara asks the question, why is there a chatas offering on Rosh Chodesh? So why? Anybody remember why? Who's the chatas offering on Rosh Chodesh for?
Hashem.
For Hashem. Because the Gemara tells us over there the very intriguing story that at the beginning of creation, the Torah tells us that Hashem made the two great luminaries. What were the two great luminaries? The sun and the moon. In the same pasuk, in the same verse, without skipping a beat, the Torah then goes on to say, Es ha'ma'or ha'gadol, the great luminary, lememshelas hayom for the daytime, ves ha'ma'or ha'katan, and the small luminary, lememshelas halayla for the nighttime. So make up your mind. In the same sentence, you say there are two great luminaries, and then you say one is great and one is small. What happened?
It becomes jealousy.
What happened?
The story of the moon being jealous.
The moon complains. The moon complains. This is why you know that the Jewish people are compared to the moon. So the moon complains to Hashem. What does the moon say? You cannot have two kings sharing a single crown. In other words, if the sun and the moon are equally bright, why do you need to? So what does Hashem say to the moon? Okay, if that's what you want, lechi mi'ati, there's the word, mi'ati, ma'at, lechi mi'ati esatzmeich. Go diminish yourself. You brought this to the table. You think this is an issue. So in that case, you diminish yourself. And from that point on, the moon is no longer a luminary. It's purely just a reflective surface. And we get to see the sun's rays bounce off the moon. Then the Gemara says, Hashem tells the people, when it comes to the sacrifices of Rosh Chodesh, Haviu olai chatos, bring a chatos offering on my behalf, al shemi atati esayoreach, because of the fact that I diminished the moon. Beautiful story, don't you think? Story doesn't make one word of sense. Not one word of sense. First of all, if Hashem created two great luminaries, who does the moon think she is? Because the moon is feminine, sorry. But I mean, who does the moon think she is? To say to Hashem, you made a mistake. Okay, so let's even wrap our heads around that somehow the moon has this level of intellect and sentient, it's a sentient being, and it has this awareness, and it has an opinion. So Hashem listens to it. Doesn't make any sense. Make any sense. No. Hashem says, you're right, I'm going to change the whole of creation now to suit you. And then when Hashem says that, after Hashem says, and therefore I want to atone for having done this, it makes no sense. Did Hashem think it was a good thing or not a good thing? Does Hashem have this in mind from the beginning of creation or not from the beginning of creation? What is going on over here? So what happens? We know that the moon is the symbol of the Jewish people. That's why our calendar, the very first mitzvah that we were ever given as a Jewish nation, is a mitzvah hachodesh hazeh lochem, that we should establish a calendar that follows the moon. Why? Because the Gemara tells us, Yisrael moinin lilevana, the Jewish people count our months following the moon, ve doimin lilevana, and we are similar to the moon. And that Gemara back there that speaks about Mi'at Yasayorech is where Hashem says to the moon, don't worry, because the greatest people in my world are also small. And it refers to the pasuk that says, David HaKatan, that David was the smallest of his brothers. So there's an indelible link between the story of the moon and the story of us. It's the story of being ma'at, of diminishing. What does it mean to diminish? What, that we should be the underdog of the world? Taka. You know what, Hashem? Bring a chatas offering every single month. If that's what happened, bring the chatas offering. What does it mean? That we are the ma'at, atem ha-ma'at. That we are the small nation in the world. That we are the nation that is like the moon, that mi'ati esatzmeich, that had diminished itself. That's relevant to this Mishnah, because here we're learning about 6 areas in which we have to diminish ourselves. What does diminish mean? So I want to ask you a question. A few months ago, there was a solar eclipse. We didn't get it in this part of the world. We didn't get to see it. But in the northern hemisphere, in many places, they could see the solar eclipse. It was a very big deal. What's the one stern warning that you get when there's a solar eclipse? Don't look. Don't look. So that everybody had to get those fancy glasses, or they had to get whatever they got, filters, to be able to watch the solar eclipse. Why can't you look at a solar eclipse? For the same reason you can't look at the sun. It's too intense. So when is the only time that you could look at the sun's rays?
When you see the moon.
When you look at the moon.
You see the moon.
Because there is no such thing as moonlight. All the moon does is it diminishes, it calibrates the sun's rays to the extent that the human eye can look at those rays without being harmed. That is the role of the moon. The role of the moon is to calibrate sunshine in a way that humans or the world can absorb it without harm. Now, we all love to say the fact that we are Or Lagoyim, that we're supposed to be a light unto the nations. What does that mean, that we're supposed to be a light unto the nations? It means our job is to reflect godliness into the world. If Hashem were to expose divinity into the world, it would be far too intense. Nobody could handle it. It would blow us all away. We know that because at the time of the giving of the Torah, when there was just a brief moment of divine exposure, we know what happened. Our neshamas left our bodies. We were flung back a whole distance of the size of the camp of the Jewish people. They had to send an emergency troop of angels to put everybody back together again. So we understand that divine exposure is too intense. It's going to obliterate us. So what does Hashem do? He embeds that divine energy within His Torah. He gives that Torah to us so that we could then reflect that divine energy into the world in a way that makes the world a healthy, more meaningful, aligned place. And this is what we've been doing for the last 3,300 years. And please God, reaching the culmination of this mission, so that Hashem can expose Himself in the world, like the Navi Yeshaya tells us, "V'nigle kvoid Hashem v'ro kol basar yachtov," that the time of Mashiach is a time where Hashem is revealed in a way that kol basar, that the physical human experience can tolerate divine revelation. How? Because we've been seeding divine revelation in every corner of the earth since Jews walked this earth, and more specifically, seeing as it's Erev Tisha B'Av, more specifically, since the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, where Jews have walked the whole earth. If not for the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, we would not have a Jewish community in Joburg, or in New York, or in Sao Paulo, or in Melbourne. It's only because of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash we got out to reflect the divine light into the world, and that's preparing the world for Mashiach. So these 6 areas that we're going to look at, it's not just simply a matter of reduce your involvement in this particular area. It's miut schora, miut derech eretz, etc. It's see the world in a different context. Diminish, on the one hand, the worldliness of these experiences, and simultaneously channel, which is also a form of diminishing because you're calibrating the divine energy, calibrate and channel the divine energy into those places. So schoira, when a person goes to work from a Jewish perspective, has to look radically different from how any other person goes out there to make a living. Mi'ut schoira. It's not about the physical assets or wealth that we're going to build for ourselves. Mi'ut schoira. It's about bringing divine energy into the experience of the business. David HaMelech says this very clearly in Tehillim, because David HaMelech tells us in Tehillim that the template for Jewish work, for Jewish business, is Yegia kapecha kisoichel. And then he goes on to say, Ashrecha v'toivlach. Yegia kapecha, by the work of your hands, the labor of your hands, you will eat. And then, Ashrecha v'toivlach, you will be happy or praiseworthy, and things will be good for you. What is he telling us? We already learned a Mishnah earlier in Pirkei Avos that says, Kol Torah she'ein ima melacha. Anytime that a person studies Torah and that Torah is not accompanied by work, soifa b'teila v'gereres avon. That kind of Torah will eventually disappear and it will drag a person into sin. That means that we have to work. That means that we have an obligation to engage the world and to be productive citizens and to earn a living and not just to live on handouts. But we need to know that is b'miut s'choira. What's the whole chap of s'choira? I don't know. I'm not a business person. I can't tell you these things. I can only observe. So what goes on in the business world?
There's a lot of corruption.
That's true. There's a lot of corruption. But what goes on? Let's keep in the healthy part of the business world, right? Without the corruption.
People overdo it.
People overdo it.
You got to balance it.
But what really happens? I'm saying what should happen. People become obsessed. That's what happens. People eat, sleep, dream their business. That's what happens. Yegia kapecha, when David HaMelech says that you work with your hands, the implication is that you work with your hands, not with your whole being. In other words, hands are the part of a body that is supposed to be doing the work. In those days, obviously, a lot of work was labor, was menial work. So your hands do the work. The brain is for Torah. Mi'ut schora, you diminish how much self is invested in the business. The really advanced faculties that we have, the mind and the emotions, those should be reserved for relationship with Hashem, for our davening, for our Torah learning, etc. Business, yes, of course, you've got to think about business, you've got to strategize, you've got to be smart, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, you also have to remember that Hashem is the one who gives us the brachas. Hashem is the one who empowers us that our efforts should actually bear fruit. Miut schora is not a matter of how many hours a person works or how many hours a person is on the road. It's a matter of where the person's head lies. I think I told you the story once before about the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe who had a chassid who was in the business of selling galoshes. It was a very lucrative business living in Russia with the snow and the mud and the rain. So you sold these rubber galoshes that people used to wear. They called them kaloshin. So once this chassid came and the Rebbe said to him, I've seen many people in all my years who walk around with their feet in kaloshin. You are the first person I've met who walks around with a kop in kaloshin. Right? Your head is completely obsessed in the business. So miut zechora means two things. It means firstly to remove the higher faculties of who we are so that our blood pressure does not track the stock market, but rather that we reserve our intellect and our emotions for connection to Hashem on the one hand, and on the other hand, it means miut, like the moon, that is that reflector of divine energy into business, that when a Jewish person steps into the business environment, it is as a representative of Hashem. It's not purely as another person chasing wealth. The business environment is a place to be able to bring holiness, to be able to learn, to be able to give tzedakah, and to be able to engage with people, Jewish people to invite them to participate in Torah and mitzvahs, and non-Jewish people to invite them to learn about the 7 Ochad laws. That's part of our responsibility, as the Rambam says very clearly in Hilchos Melachim. That's our responsibility to educate the whole world about how to live a moral code. It's fascinating when you meet people who actually live by these principles and you see what kind of an influence and impact they have on people that we would ordinarily have no contact with. So it's a gift. Miut zechora is not that you work less necessarily, but it's less self invested in the work and more godliness invested in the world. And that's directly linked to the next detail, which is miut derech eretz. Now, there are some of the commentaries that say derech eretz is a euphemism, and it's referring to the intimacy of a couple, and saying that the correct way, the holy way, is that we don't go crazy even in our own permitted relationships. But derech eretz in its most generic sense, yes, I know, we all think of the word derech eretz and we immediately think that that's normal contact, being a mensch, being nice, which is true. But bear in mind that when it says derech eretz kodma la Torah, that derech eretz preceded Torah, that does not mean, as most people unfortunately think it to mean, that if you have derech eretz, then you'll be able to learn Torah, and if you don't, you can't. It's an historical statement. Derech eretz, the normal way of the world, was around before the Torah was given. So therefore, miut derech eretz is quite similar to miut zechora. It means that we reduce the conduct of what's so-called normal in the world, so that we're not just like everybody else. Just because something is accepted in society as the way that people are expected to behave, doesn't mean it's the way that we're expected to behave. I'll use a little example. It's safe to say it now because the whole thing is over. But for the last couple of weeks, people have been quite obsessed with a particular athletics event. Right? You go back into the history and you discover that it was predicated on outright avodah zarah. 100% avodah zarah. The original games had big statues of Zeus and all these various things, and it was absolutely rooted in idolatry. There's a massive halakhic issue with not only watching the games, but saying the name because of what it represents. But derech eretz, in the normal world, everybody will say, what's the big deal? It's completely parav. It's, nobody's misbehaving, except for the opening ceremony maybe, but nobody's misbehaving, nobody's harming anybody. It's not like the gladiators, they're not killing people. And there's this impression that we have that because something appears to be so-called innocuous in the broader world, it's kosher for us. Miut derech eretz means we have to acknowledge that the things that are considered normal in society, for us, we take at arm's distance. Just because it sounds parav doesn't mean it is Jewish. So that's part of this awareness of miut derech eretz. So if a person is invested in all the stuff that's going on, whether it be the trends, the fashions, the downloads, the apps, whatever happens to be the prominent thing in society at a particular point in time, then we have to realize that that doesn't get us closer to learning Torah. What does get us closer, or to acquiring Torah, because this is Kinyan Torah, it's acquiring, not just learning Torah, is to miut derech eretz. I don't have to be like everybody else. I don't necessarily have to keep up with the latest fashion trends. I don't necessarily have to keep up with the latest social media. I don't even necessarily have to keep up with the latest news. I think I once mentioned to you that there was a guy who took me to task once. He said, Rabbi, you don't watch the news. How will you know what's going on in the world? I said, you'll tell me. But the point is that if there's real news, unfortunately we get to hear about it. If you think about it, October 7th, nobody was watching TV or looking at the news or anything, and we all heard all about it. Because unfortunately that's how it works. The things we need to know find their way to us. So miut derech eretz means just because everybody else, if you remember in the old days, I don't know if they still do it, in the old days used to get onto an eget bas, and on the top of the hour, they would play the news on the eget bas. I don't know if they still do it or not. Right? They used to do it. Kol Yisrael Yerushalayim, like whatever, that was the thing. It becomes like derech eretz. You have to know at certain times. You have to be told what the news is. At certain times, you have to be told how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to think. Not a Jewish way. That's not how we do it. That's why we have a Torah. The Torah will tell us what to think, and the Torah will tell us how to interpret the world. Miut tainug, and then he says we have to reduce tainug. We have to reduce pleasure. What does that mean? To reduce pleasure. What does that mean? So what does it mean to reduce pleasure? One of the things that we know is an axiom of life. It is impossible for a person to run in two directions simultaneously. I know most mothers try, but you can't. It's not possible. It's the way Hashem designed us. There are various things, by the way, in this conversation that remind us about the human limitations. One of the human limitations is you can't run in two directions. What does it mean you can't run in two directions? It means that a person is incapable of being passionate about two opposite things. It's not possible. So, for example, you cannot be a passionate lover of the braai and a passionate protector of animal rights. It doesn't work. Got to choose a side. Either this or that. That's life. Now, the greatest conflict of passion that exists is between the neshama and the body. Because the body, it's very easy to find the pleasures that satisfy the body. You can get them at any shop. You can download them. There's an app, they can deliver it to your house within 60 minutes. The pleasures of the neshama are much more subtle, much more sublime, and much more difficult to engage. So if you want instant gratification, tainug of the body, instant gratification. It's really very simple and straightforward. So for example, you might find that I don't know if this is true or not, but I'd like to do kind of an informal survey of during the course of the 9 days when we don't eat meat, how many people eat more chocolate and ice cream than usual? Because the excuse is we're not fleischig. But if you think about it, it's because we're feeling it's a bit of a rough time of the year, so subconsciously we want to sort of compensate with something, with a little bit of comfort eating. That's because the tainug of the body is very quick to reach and equally quick to wear off. So once we get into the cycle of the pursuit of personal, physical tainug, it's actually a bottomless pit. Whereas tainug of the neshama is much more elusive. To actually give the neshama pleasure takes a lot of focus, a lot of work, and usually a lot of time. And on the journey to get to that tainug, there are many disappointments. So for example, yesterday somebody said to me, it was actually here, as I was walking out yesterday, somebody said to me, when I would daven, I used to be in the zone. And now I feel like I just don't connect. Because tainug, pleasure of the neshama, is elusive. And it's not static. So for example, you know that if you're a coffee fan, you know that every time you drink a coffee, you're going to enjoy it. But if you're a davening fan, then you don't know that every single time you daven, it's going to be a meaningful experience. Some days you'll feel very connected and very inspired, and other days you'll feel like you're mamish pulling teeth. The mind is everywhere. So, if a person chases tainug of this world, then they train themselves to derive benefit and derive enjoyment from transient things. The more we train ourselves that way, the less capable we are of getting pleasure from meaningful things. So mi'ut tainug is one of the most practical pieces of advice that we could get. If a person wants to relish the Torah, then they have to be willing to relinquish all those quick and easy fixes that make us feel good. There's no question about it that the kind of tainug that a person will get through learning Torah will supersede all of those. But we have to get there. You know, if you think about it, there are certain very base levels of pleasure that we could share with animals. There are more sophisticated types of pleasure. So let's say, for example, music is a more sophisticated pleasure, and it touches us in a deeper way. But intellectual pleasure may well be the deepest human pleasure. You know, when you've battled to understand something and you eventually come to appreciate it, it's thrilling. Imagine if somebody, well, this is what it says will happen when Mashiach comes, right? The prophet Yeshaya says, when Mashiach comes, will say, Oidcha Hashem ki onaftobi. Thank you, Hashem, for all of the trouble, the distress that you gave us. We read this in the Haftarah on the last day of Pesach. Can you imagine when somebody, well, obviously Hashem clarifies for us why we went through everything that we went through. You know how thrilling, just the time of the pleasure of that. Aha! Now I get it. So, mi'ut tainug, when we reduce the amount of things in our lives that we rely upon in order to derive pleasure, and we focus on the one or two meaningful things, our davening, our connection to Hashem, our Torah learning, so that then gives us the opportunity to run in the healthy direction rather than constantly chasing our tails in a less healthy direction.
Can I interrupt or can I not?
Depends how long the interruption is. We've still got 3 more.
Yeah, well, Rabbi Weinberg gave the different levels of pleasure.
Yes.
And the greatest level of pleasure is connection with Hashem.
Connection with Hashem.
And
correct.
Beneath that is creativity.
Right.
And each of the pleasures have the good side and the flip side.
Right.
So if anything is in excess without restraint, then it becomes unholy. Too much food, too much, etc.
Etc.
Yeah.
Okay, so there you go.
Yeah, thank you for letting
Okay, let's go now to the one that everybody's very nervous about. Mi'ut sheina. We have to reduce sleep. Tell this to your teenager. What does it mean reduce sleep? We already don't sleep enough. When they wrote this in the time of the Mishnah, what time do you think people went to sleep? Shortly after it got dark. And what time did they wake up? When it got light. That means in winter, people were sleeping, 10, 11 hours. We think we're sleeping a lot because I sleep 6 hours. Like I'm a big tzaddik, I sleep 6 hours. I have a lot of self-control because I sleep 6 hours. Mi'ut sheina, diminishing sleep, may not necessarily be the call of the hour for the modern human. Because we might actually have a mitzvah to sleep a little bit more. It was the Rambam who said that you should have 8 hours of sleep. We know that the medical studies illustrate that between 6 and 8 hours, depending on the person's makeup, but less than 6 hours, l'chol adayos, everybody will tell you it's unhealthy. It has serious health implications. So what's he telling us? Miut sheina, we should sleep less. So one opinion is, don't sleep during the day. That's miut sheina. Hashem gave us the night time for sleep. Therefore, miut sheina, to reduce sleep, means don't sleep during the day. Okay? I have to be honest that for some people are going to get very nervous. Does that include Shabbos? Include the Shabbos shlof? I'll leave that for you to discuss with your Rav Moireh Hoyra'a, your local Orthodox rabbi. They can tell you if you're supposed to have a Shabbos shlof or not. Okay? Go debate it with the rabbis. But there's another perspective on this as well, a very profound perspective. When Haman goes to Achashverosh to tell him about his plan to get rid of the Jewish people, he says to him, Yeshnoi am echad. There is a single Yeshnoi, there is a single nation on earth. Mefuzar, Mefoira ben ha'amim, they're scattered between the other nations of your kingdom, etc., etc. So the Gemara takes that little presentation of Haman and says the word Yeshnoi is that Haman came to Achashverosh and he said, let's get rid of the Jews. So Achashverosh says, that's impossible. Can't get rid of the Jews. Hashem protects them. And he says, don't worry about that. Yeshnoi, remember that the Megillah, like every other book of Torah, is written without vowels, should actually be read, Yoshnu am echad. There's a nation that fell asleep. And the Gemara says it means, Yoshnu min ha-mitzvahs. They fell asleep with regards to the performance of mitzvahs. Miut sheina means we have to reduce the degree to which we are spiritually asleep. You know the famous line in Shir HaShirim where Shlomo HaMelech says, Ani yeshena v'libi er. I am asleep, but my heart is awake. So what did Chazal tell us? Ani yeshena, the Zohar says, begalusa. I'm sleeping in galus. The definition of galus is not that we're not in a particular geographical location. It's not the fact that we're living in a diaspora instead of living in Israel. It is possible to be in a galus in Israel, unfortunately. Because the definition of galus is to be asleep with regards to our mitzvahs. Miut sheina, if a person wants to engage with Torah, then the first thing that they need to do, well not the first, one of the things that they need to do is they need to reduce that sense of being asleep. What does it mean to be asleep? What happens when we're asleep? We don't know because we're sleeping. What happens when we're asleep? One of the key things that happens when we sleep is we close our eyes. Even those people who are a little bit eerie, they sleep with their eyes open. Or if you've ever seen somebody who's sleepwalking, the fact is you don't see. The first symptom of sleep is not seeing things the right way that we're supposed to see them. And that's why we don't do mitzvahs, because we don't see things the right way. We convince ourselves that it's okay, and if I don't do the mitzvahs, Hashem will love me anyway, or this particular mitzvah is not so relevant right now, or if you knew my circumstances, you'd appreciate why I don't have the capacity to do this mitzvah right now. All of that is sleep. We're not seeing things the way we're meant to see it. Because if we saw things clearly, then we would know that if Hashem says you've got to do these things, that means that you absolutely can do these things. Hashem doesn't play games. So to be asleep is to lose sight of what we're supposed to focus on. If a person is going to study Torah just simply as some intellectual pursuit and not recognize that this is about a connection to Hashem, and the way we forge that connection is through the things that we do, the mitzvahs, etc., then they're not going to be able to associate properly with Torah. So, to access Torah, mi'ut sheina, we've got to reduce the extent to which we are spiritually asleep. Likewise, mi'ut sicha. We have to reduce sicha. What's sicha? Not dibur. Dibur is the biological process of speech. Sicha is a classification of a certain kind of speech. What kind of speech is sicha? Conversation, schmoozing. Mi'ut sicha. You know what it says about a Talmid Chacham? A person who's a true Torah scholar, it says, afilu sichas chulin, even their ordinary conversation, tzricha limud, is something we should be analyzing and studying. Because when they speak, they don't speak about what's happening, how's the weather, wow, I think winter's over. I actually saw the first blossoms in my garden. That's amazing. Talmidei Chachamim don't get together and speak about, did you see the price of eggs in kosher world? Did you see what happened? What's Sicha? For us, Sicha is small talk. For a Talmid Chacham, every conversation is meaningful. Every conversation is filled with content. And therefore, it is possible to learn reams from them. We learned last time in the previous cluster that one of the keys to being able to access Torah is Shimush Chachamim, to be able to serve the Chachamim. And one of the reasons, I don't remember which of the Meforshim says it, one of the reasons is because even listening to how they speak will educate us how we should speak. But Miut Sicha means to reduce the meaningless talk that we have and rather fill ourselves as much as possible with meaningful talk. So for example, when we get together with people socially, we should actually have some type of meaningful conversation with them that has some kind of value, that has some kind of message. Okay, a lot of work. Everybody thought it was difficult to sleep less. This is much more work. To speak less nonsense and to speak more meaningful content, that's a really big challenge. And the last is b'miut schoik, by reducing laughter. That does not mean b'miut simcha. We shouldn't confuse the two. It's not suggesting that we reduce simcha, because simcha is supposed to be a constant right across the experience of being Jewish, like the Shulchan Aruch says at the end of Orach Chaim, the very last halacha in Chelek Orach Chaim, which is the section of Shulchan Aruch that tells you how you're supposed to live on a day-to-day basis, quotes the pasuk from Shlomo HaMelech, V'toiv leiv mishte tamid, that a person who has a good heart will always look for an opportunity to celebrate. Simcha is supposed to be a constant within the Jewish experience. Schoik and simcha are not the same. Laughter is not always a symptom of simcha. Sometimes it's a smoke screen where simcha is lacking. So somebody's so funny and they're so humorous and they're causing everybody to laugh and they're laughing, and everything could very often mean that there's a lack of meaningful simcha in a person's life. So mi'ut schoik means specifically to reduce laughter. We do know that it says when Mashiach comes, and we know this because we said, obviously in Tila, but we say it in benching, so it's much more familiar to us. Then when Mashiach comes, then we'll have the right to true laughter, to the kind of laughter that is associated with meaning, that is associated with real simcha, as opposed to the kind of superficial laughter that we often have today. I want to suggest something else. I didn't really see this in a source. It's kind of like connecting the dots. So if this is invalid, you can get a refund afterwards. But there's a very powerful teaching, a mystical teaching that says that Torah is called Sha'ashuim. It's called Hashem's pleasure. And so, pleasure. And so there are places in Torah that refer to Sechoik, Hashem's laughter, as a representation of Torah. Except that when we refer to the Torah as Hashem's laughter, it's the Torah as Hashem sees it, as opposed to the Torah how we experience it, because our experience of Torah is obviously much more limited. I mean, we're not even scratching the surface. We think we're such big sages, we haven't begun to scratch the surface of infinity, obviously. So perhaps, just a thought that I had, I don't know if this is valid or not, but perhaps mi'ut schoik is the same principle as the reflection of the sun's rays. In the same way as our job as the moon in the story is to be able to reflect godliness into the world, mi'ut schoik could also possibly mean we have to take what is schoik, what is Hashem's laughter, what is Hashem's joy in the Torah, and calibrate it into language that the world can understand, because there's no question that the world cannot conceptualize Hashem's joy of Torah. So we, through our learning and through our innovation within Torah, because one of the things we're supposed to do in Torah is to find our own insights and our own innovation, so we then can calibrate mi'ut schoik, we can reduce that overwhelming joy that only Hashem could experience and package it as personal joy that any person could experience through the course of Torah. And obviously what that means is that when we learn Torah, the Torah learning that we do should not be like dragging our feet, but it should be with a sense of schoik, with a sense of pleasure, with a sense that this is our joy. And obviously that will open up the gateways. The Maharal, I think it is, says that when a person learns Torah without joy, then they don't really get Torah. But when a person has simcha in the course of Torah, that opens up the mind and it allows us to understand Torah properly. So please God, we should successfully master these areas, and we should be able to reflect godliness into the world to such an extent that we can cross that threshold finally, for once and for all, to manifest Hashem fully in the world with the coming of Mashiach, and we could celebrate in Yerushalayim tonight instead of having to read Eicha.
Amen.